With us today are two distinguished speakers, our panelists who have spent their entire careers in the energy industry. I would like to first introduce Mr. Sergey Vakulenko, and he is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. He has spent his entire career in the international energy industry, including for 11 years, he served as head of strategy, innovations, and sustainability in Gazprom Net. He worked in very many positions over his career as an economist, project manager, shareholder representative, business developer, portfolio manager, consultant, and head of practice in various energy companies, with projects from all around the world, from Siberia, Caspian Sea, North Sea, Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, and Japan and other countries. Originally, he's a Russian physicist and also our Fletcher alum, so welcome back. I would also like to introduce Dr. Craig Kennedy, who is a historian, energy commentator, and a retired international finance professional. He worked for 20 years advising corporate clients worldwide on capital raising and strategic transactions. He collaborates closely with the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions and publishes some of his analysis on his Substack, Navigating Russia. He was working first with Morgan Stanley, then with Bank of America Merrill Lynch, where he was a vice chairman. He has a PhD in history from Harvard, and he was also teaching at Harvard, and now he's writing a book on the history of Russia's oil industry since 1860. So we're excited to see that book come out. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our panelists, and also just to suggest if each one of you could do like a brief opening remarks, like around up to 7 minutes, and then we will have a bit of discussion, and we will have a lot of questions, Q&A with the audience. We will leave a lot of time for that. So please, Mr. Sergey Vakulenko, the floor is yours.
Good morning, indeed. A very vast field to cover, so I'll keep my remarks now for a minimum, and would like to cover most in the Q&A and discussions. Just a very brief recap of what was going on with the Russian oil industry, gas industry in the last couple of years, but also with the reminiscences to 2015. Interestingly, Russian oil industry might be better prepared to what had happened after February 2022 by what was going on since 2014. Since 2014, since annexation of Crimea, since the very beginning of low-intensity Russian-Ukrainian war, there were sanctions against Russia, mild ones, and they were mostly concentrated on oil and gas industry. Back then, the concept of those sanctions was not to suffocate the current industry, but to at least make its future developments harder. So sanctions were focusing on offshore things, shale developments, and so on. But they were already in place. So since 2014, Russian oil industry, probably one of the few ones in Russia, has started developing ways of working around it. So import substitution was starting to become an important thing. Russian oil industry has been moved towards lower permeability formation, because shale isn't really a technical term. Some of the tight formations are not necessarily shale, and there is ambiguity on what you can do or you cannot do with imported equipment. So they were developing their own capabilities of doing this. There is a concern whether US origin oilfield service providers like Schlumberger, like Baker Hughes, would stay in the country if something happens, if sanction regime tightens. So they were also developing their own capabilities, building ties with Chinese manufacturers, helping Russian oil industry manufacturers developing their capabilities and like. Interestingly enough, there were also forays into developing alternative payment mechanisms. First, cargoes of Russian crude were sold for rubles to international customers back in 2018, if my memory doesn't fail me. It has never been a large element. It was just a proof of concept, if you wish, but it was there. Nevertheless, nobody in the industry, neither in oil nor in gas, was prepared for what had happened. Really, it was done in great secrecy. I was still working in Gazprom back then. Few weeks before the war, the central bank and Ministry of Economy actually were asking Russian companies to run a stress test of what would happen to them if the sanctions strike. The companies were asking, okay, what sort of sanctions? Sanctions, what for? What could happen? Build your own scenarios was the answer. The assumption was that Russia might, well, okay, everybody was reading newspapers, everybody was reading what the West were saying. There was clearly some growing up of tensions around Donetsk and Lugansk. So the idea was that, well, maybe Russia recognizes Donetsk and Luhansk. Maybe because of that, Russia would be excluded from SWIFT. Well, what else could they do? And they've all built their own scenarios. They've all reported what would happen to them because of this to the central bank and I think Ministry of Economy. The answer was, well, it would be painful, but not deadly. So it was all collated and probably was sent up to the very top and probably might serve to mislead Putin and whoever was planning the invasion that Russian economy was stronger than it might be. Of course, well, they didn't ever ask the right question, right? So they didn't get the right answer. I knew it. So February 22nd came as a shock, no doubt about it. And for about a month, everybody was quite shocked and everything started to look scary. It took about 7 months for the Russian oil industry to reorganize itself. It was difficult. Traditional Western buyers were cutting the contracts. There were concerns whether they would be able to keep oil field operations as they were going on. There were concerns about severe decline in oil production, that dependencies on the Western equipment, Western technologies, and so on would be too strong and production would go down, equipment would fail with no spare parts, things like this. After 6-7 months, roughly to September, October, those concerns subsided. They found their way around, they've organized the way to receive payments, and that's also the time when the discounts on Russian oil, and back then there were no sanctions, no nothing, it was just more like boycott and risk aversion rather than sanctions, also started to shrink quite a lot. So that was the new phase. Interesting enough, the price cap introduced in December didn't change much. By then, much of the flows of Russian oil have already been diverted to other jurisdictions, India and China, and also Indian discount that was quite heavy in the summer and early fall of 2022 came to $4 or $5 a barrel or something like that and stayed though. If you believe Indian customs statistics, I believe there are other ways to measure it, and there is lots of argument of what's trustworthy or not. But according to Indian customs statistics, according to Chinese customs statistics, that discount shrunk. How much those countries were paying for Russian oil. For a while, Russian fiscal system relied on reported prices and were taxing Russian oil industry as if indeed it was selling the price at what was quoted as Urals price for Platts and like. Then it was realized that it was a huge gift to the oil companies or people around them. So the Russian finance ministry switched to imputed price and imputed discount. And there wasn't much complaints from the oil companies, which is kind of a symptom that that's really what they're selling oil for. And they really have the money to pay the taxes. So that's the story. Well, there are still ongoing concerns whether Russia would be able to maintain its production base, because again, much of the renaissance of the Russian oil industry in the noughts and the teens have been indeed based on Western technology. Turned out much of this Western technology has been well domesticated. So if you look at the current Russian operations, what's going on in Western Siberia, what's going on even in the ongoing Arctic projects, probably Russia can support this going on for quite a long time. When it comes to parts, equipment, and so on, still there are issues. For example, things like turbines, rotating equipment. And if you look at a generic Russian oil field, one of the big ones, it might need 1 gigawatt of power to keep all the pumps going, all the oil separators, heaters, and things like this. 1 gigawatt, it's a huge, well, Chernobyl nuclear power station had 4 1 gigawatt reactors. There are nuclear reactors that make half a gigawatt and so on. So scale. That power was produced with turbines, Western-made turbines, running on associated gas. Well, turbines have their lifespan. So at some point they would come to the end of life. So that's an issue. There are other things like this, but so far it looks like technological base is more or less preserved. However, looking forward, maybe the prospects of Russian oil production are not as bright, because that's an aging oil province, and always there are plans that the natural decline in oil production would have to be replaced by production from the new fields. And as far as I know, many of the projects that Russia did have when it came to new fields most of them are mothballed now, because it would have to be an outstep into further remote Arctic regions, would need Arctic navigation, Arctic loading facilities, and so on. And much of that was supposed to be imported when those projects were on drawing boards. This would be hard to replace. So when it comes to oil, Russia is probably facing a graceful decline, but not a sudden drop. Refining is also an interesting case, because in the very beginning of 2024, Russian refining faced a new challenge. That's a wave of Ukrainian drone attacks. Those looked extremely spectacular. When you come to visit the refinery, they would take your cell phone off you. They would take your lighter from you if you're a smoker. So if you are an occasional visitor to a refinery, you'd be under impression that it's just a potential huge fire, that a tiny little spark would make the whole thing, which is sometimes the size of 1 square mile, could go up in the air. Well, reality is different. Soviet refineries, and most of the refineries current Russia have been built to Soviet construction code, and construction code has been developed with World War II experience in mind. And the idea was that if there is a 1-ton bomb falling on one of the installations, other installations would have to stay intact. So, which meant that there is a very substantial spacing, that all these refineries are built on a grid, and the grid size is chosen in a way that neighboring installations do not go ablaze if one of them is exploding. And also, there's quite a lot of firefighting equipment. And again, all the personnel, all the design is done with explosive and flammable liquids in mind. In some sense, refineries are more fireproof and are much better positioned to contain fire than, I don't know, at a warehouse or something like that, just because people are constantly aware of what they're having there. And if we look at what was the outcome of Ukrainian drones attacks, sure, there was damage to primary refining units, which shut them down. But I guess what people were hoping for, that a larger parts of the refineries would go up in flames in the ensuing fire. Well, that didn't happen. And then it turned out that primary refining units are relatively easy to fix. most of those units were fixed within 3 weeks. So it did cause monetary damage to Russian refining, no doubt. They had to spend money on fixes. They had to export crude oil as opposed to refined products. There are losses on that. But other than that, you can't say that the damage was material. At the same time, there are other things going on. For example, a Lukoil refinery went substantially curtailed its operation even before the wave of attacks has started back in December. One of the pieces of equipment failed. They couldn't get the spare part. So that installation has been sitting idle for 4 months. But after the 4 months, they managed to get it back to work with a part manufactured in Russia. It probably has costed them more. It took them 4 months, and ordering from supplier would probably take 2 to 4 weeks. Nevertheless, they managed to do it. Whether they'll be able to do it on a scale is a good question. One case, they were able to do it. If the Ukrainians would keep wave after wave of drone attacks on refineries, the outcome may be different. If it would be not single hits of drone on single units, but concerted hits, like 15 drones hitting the refineries and repeating the attacks in 2 weeks, the outcome might be different. Well, that didn't happen. Why? We wouldn't know. Maybe the Ukrainians didn't have the scale to cause so, but we have what we have. So, and looks like drones attacks on refineries subsided much since the spring. So probably there was a feeling that's not particularly effective. Should I stop here? Well, there are also stories here. Okay, well, there are a couple other subjects that we might want to discuss. That's the price cap, that's Russian gas imports to China, that's the whole story of Russian gas exports to Russian gas exports to China, Russian gas exports to Europe. But let's stop here. I think I overspoke my 7 minutes, and we'll continue in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Great. I think I have to speak directly into here. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And it's always a pleasure to speak alongside Sergey because he's one of the most knowledgeable people about the Russian oil industry. And I always learn new things when I talk with Sergey. And he helps me challenge some of my own assumptions as well and observations. I want to step back for a moment and try to take a look at some of the broader discussions we've been having about economic warfare as it relates to the Russian energy industry. I think at the risk of oversimplifying, the views we've been hearing yesterday and so far, I can't really judge on today, have really fallen into what might be called two camps or two narratives. The first one, well, before I describe what they are, there's one thing they both agree on wholeheartedly, and that is that Russian energy revenues are critical to the larger question about the impact of economic and efficacy of sanctions on Russia. So it's very good to be looking at that today. The two camps as such can be called, on the one hand, what we call invincible fortress Russia. And the narrative around that goes like this, that after 2014, Russia took stock of all its vulnerabilities. It began bulking up and anticipating all the things that might happen to it in the event of a full-scale conflict. And so when the West took its best shot at Russia at the beginning of 2022, Russia wobbled a bit, but quickly came back to its feet and showed remarkable resiliency. We'd given it our best shot and we could barely lay a glove on it. And much of the credit was due to the remarkable talents and creativity of the Russian technocracy that had foreseen all of this and put in place effective countermeasures. So that's the invincible fortress Russia narrative. And the conclusion is we really need to reconsider whether we want to continue with economic warfare because we're just taking on risks to ourselves and not really landing any blows. Now, the other camp is what you might call the mutually assured destruction camp. And it says, actually, we do have the ability to deliver some hard blows, but in doing so, we risk having blowback on ourselves because, as we heard from Sergey Alexashenko, Russia is our gas station. We are reliant, we're dependent on Russia for stable energy prices. So if we hit too hard, this will redound against us and hurt our economies, send us into recessions, etc. So those are the two groups. There's the mutually assured destruction group, and it says we need to be really careful. In fact, we need to be risk averse here. And the other one that says we can take a shot, but we won't land a glove. So I think it's useful to take a look at two case studies of what's actually happened over the last couple of years in the Russian oil and gas sector to see what sort of evidence there is to support one side or the other. And you could find a bit of both. But I think on balance, the Fortress Russia analogy or camp has a very, very difficult time supporting itself in evidence. The mutually assured destruction camp, there's more evidence, but I think there are more nuances there that we need to consider further. So I'd like to start my first case study around gas, and then I'll get to oil and a bit about the shadow fleet. On gas, some of you who have studied the history of the Russian oil industry will remember that in the 1960s, there were remarkable discoveries of both oil and gas in West Siberia. And the gas discoveries were monumental. Nobody had ever seen gas deposits that large before. But there was a paradox. When the Soviets discovered it, they also realized that it was effectively useless to them unless they were able to strike a deal with Europe. And why is this? They were so large and so remote that the technology you would need to deliver that to larger markets required large diameter pipe and heady compressor technology that even 1960s Soviet industry did not possess, but the Europeans did. And so they sent delegations to Europe. They said, we would like to buy your technology. And the Europeans said, how are you going to pay for it? And they said, we would like you to lend us the money. And the Europeans said, well, how are you going to pay us back? We would like you to buy the gas. And so they struck a deal, this trilateral deal where the Europeans provided technology, they provided capital, and they provided a market. And it was so lucrative for Russia that they had enough money left over that they were able to build out the entire infrastructure for delivery to Russian consumers and allow them to buy the gas below cost. And that model has basically been in place up until 2022. But we will set that aside and we will fast forward to another challenge that Russia had. Europe was pretty much fully satisfied by 2005, 2010, 2015, and Russia realized LNG is the way forward. If we want to take our gas to the world, we have to have LNG capabilities. Now, they've been talking about LNG since the 1980s, and it's been around for even longer, but it's complicated. You have to take natural gas and you have to freeze it into a liquid form, put it on complicated refrigerated ships and move it. And even by 2015, 2020, despite all of the investment that Russia has made into trying to develop the technology, they really don't have what it takes, either in terms of the ship fabrication capabilities or the liquefaction capabilities. And so again, they invited in Shell, they invited in Total, they went to Western banks for financing, and they started selling to Europe. And that's how the LNG business got started. Here we are in 2022, and suddenly this creates a real vulnerability for Russia. You've got Arctic 2 LNG that wants to come on stream, and Treasury and the UK, after taking a look at LNG for a while and studying it, suddenly realized that there are a number of vulnerable places that they can put pressure on. They can say, we're sanctioning Novatek, so that means that the French have to pull out. They can say that we're sanctioning some of the technology, which means that there's a delay in bringing this on stream, which means that the contracts that are in place have to be declared in force majeure, abrogated. All sorts of issues, one after another, begin to fall away or to arise because Western sanctioning authorities sort of pinpoint a series of vulnerabilities and begin pressing. And they press on them in a way that actually doesn't cause a lot of instability in the global energy markets. LNG is still relatively small. It trades by long-term contracts, et cetera. Now, Novatek's put a huge amount of money in. They finally managed to get this loaded on some ships, but then the ships get sanctioned and they're still effectively at sea trying to deliver to the end user. Now, the thing about LNG is that if you contracted for a cargo to be delivered to you, it's a long-term contract and you expect a series of them over time. You can't simply say, oh, that one's been held up. I'm going to pick up a phone and call my broker and get another LNG cargo delivered. They're largely all tied up. There's a bit of spot trading, but not a lot. So this is a small case study where there's been effective use of targeted sanctions to block actually a very important part of Russia's future development in energy. And so I think that the three takeaways on the gas case study are, number one, that technology does matter here, that there's a specific asymmetry on technology to it. Certain technologies in oil and gas are hard to develop internally, and you also cannot source them from certain places like China and India because it's not an area of expertise. So there's a strong reliance on the West. The same thing goes for tanker fabrication. It's South Korea that's been holding up the tankers that the Russians were trying to buy. So one is technology. Second is, of course, capital that we discussed earlier. And third is markets. You need to really, if you want to switch away from Europe, you need to show convincingly to Asian buyers that you'll be able to perform. And now Asian buyers are going to be very dubious about Russia's ability to perform on its LNG contracts, and that's going to hurt it. Second case study is around oil. And I think Sergey laid it out very nicely. While there was some effort to prepare for potential full-scale sanctions, nobody really could begin to imagine what that might entail. And we know this because of a meeting that Putin himself had in May of 2022, when he called together senior Kremlin officials, as the Europeans suddenly decided off the back of the Bucha atrocities that they were going to stop buying Russian oil and that they were actually going to deny Russia access to Europe's export infrastructure. And by that, I mean tankers, insurance, finance, that Russia historically had very heavily relied on. And this was something that Europe hadn't actually planned to do because they were reassuring Russia at the outset and back in February, just 2 months earlier, we're with you for oil. We're not going to touch your gas. We may go after other things, but not that. We won't touch energy. But then there was a change of heart. Europe didn't have a plan. And Putin said, this is a tectonic shift. Those are his exact words. Everything's changed. We now have to build an entire infrastructure, a value chain infrastructure, all the way to our new markets. And that means shipping, it means finance, it means trade settlement, it means insurance. Go do it. And they went forward into the world. And as Sergey said, there was a lot of progress made in the next 7 months. They weren't able to get the sort of insurance deal that they wanted, but the central bank stepped up and said, we'll provide the insurance that you need. And while it wasn't good enough for Western buyers, we weren't buying anymore. And it was good enough for the Chinese and good enough for the Indians to allow Russian ships into their ports. But then there was the question of the ships themselves. And that brings us to the matter of the shadow fleet. So Russia looks around, where are there shadow tankers? There's the Iranian trade, the Venezuela trade, but these are, there are not very many of them. Russia's needs are many times greater, and they need really reliable ships as well, that they can work 24/7 and will be fully dedicated. And the only way to do that is to buy them yourself. And so buying agents went to all the major shipbroking areas of the world and started buying up every tanker they could get their hands on. Prices more than doubled for a 15-year-old Aframax. And within a year, by the middle of 2023, somebody had spent upwards of $8 billion, a lot of money, buying several hundred used tankers. And they were all going into the Russia trade. Now, you don't find a venture capitalist in Dubai or the Marshall Islands putting out that kind of money. We know where it came from because they told us this was being financed primarily by Russian banks. It was a lot of money. Yet, throughout this time, Russian oil was trading below the price cap. It was trading below the price cap, and we can talk about, what was actually happening. Pardon me?
Maybe that would be a good thing.
Yeah, it was trading below the price cap. And as a consequence, for the first 10 months, the shadow fleet wasn't actually creating value. But finally, they cut a deal with the Saudis. They got the price up in the summer of 2023, and the shadow fleet looked like it was on its way. But then something else happened. The US Treasury suddenly said, you know what? We're going to sanction these ships. And they started to put direct ship sanctions on. And lo and behold, those ships immediately fell out of the rotation. And the reason was quite simple. Those were ships that were going to places like India and China. And the Americans were saying, look, Russia's building its own infrastructure for settlement, shipping, and insurance. You can use that if you want, or you can use ours. Take your pick. Russia's a small amount of their overall trade. In the oil industry in particular, the dollar is by far and away the cornerstone of the industry. And I'll just give you one statistic. Physical oil traded in the world, the stuff that actually goes in ships, is 1/30 of the size of the paper financial trade in oil, and that's all dollar denominated. So all of these guys don't want to buy or take oil on these ships if it's going to put their dollar accounts at risk. So to wrap up, I think the two key takeaways from these two case studies is there is a lot of leverage that can be brought to bear, but Russia is so important in the energy markets that it has to be done very, very carefully in order to avoid disturbing the market, and needs to be done slowly and gradually. But the second thing is we also need to be able to measure and assess the risk accurately. And I think that's one thing that we've been very poor at, both assessing not only the risks on the energy markets, but also the actual impact on Russia. And we can come back and talk about Russia, whether it is a brilliant economy that is untouchable, or whether there are some underlying issues in the economy that we need to be watching more carefully.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. So I know that there will be a lot of questions about the present situation and especially about the current tensions. I know we discussed a little bit about the role of what was successful, what are the lessons learned, what was strategic planning, where it worked, where it didn't. I wanted to pick up on several topics that are a little bit broader. One would be to look at this whole situation and think about how are global energy dynamics shifting as a result of what we have seen. I wanted to pick up on the point of the decline question, and if Russia is indeed planning so strategically and it in a way ameliorated the effects of sanctions, to what extent is there like this larger plan for broader decline of fossil fuels? And connected to that, how do you see sanctions helping or hurting international efforts to tackle climate change? So if I could ask each one of you to give us this big picture of where are things going, how should we be thinking about Russia in the current situation, the overall trends in the industry, and basically this sustainability. So maybe I can start.
Right. Russian government, it hasn't published it yet, but it has commissioned a new version of Russian energy strategy. This time it was to 2050. And the work was going on this for probably a good part of the year. And the first leaks appeared in July. And as we speak, there's a Russian Energy Week conference going on in Moscow, the biggest industry conference on the subject. Putin speaking, so it's a very official and high-level thing. And they were acknowledging that the leaks are valid and were actually discussing the strategy in there. The strategy foresees that Russia will be producing pretty much at the current level of oil production until 2050. We haven't seen the document yet, so we don't know exactly how they're going or thinking or planning or declaring that they're going to achieve that. There are some also very interesting statements on gas exports. They don't foresee any substantial restart of gas exports to Europe. They think that pipeline gas exports to China would continue power of Siberia 1, power of Siberia 2, and Sakhalin gas pipeline, how they foresee a huge growth in LNG plants. Well, some questions raised based on that. Okay. When we talk about levels of Russian oil production, we have to bear in mind that the cost of the current oil production is probably $20-30 a barrel all in. If you look at what does it cost to produce new oil in the existing traditional provinces. Unfortunately, that's declining. If we talk about how much would it cost to produce oil from tighter oil reserves or from frontier areas, this could be anything from $40 to maybe $60 a barrel. But then the amount Russia produces is controlled by the tax. If the finance ministry would lower the tax stake, Russian oil production could skyrocket. Well, capital demand for Russian oil production and the developments would also skyrocket. So actually the controller of how much Russian oil industry spends and how much is it going to produce is not the energy ministry, it's the finance ministry. And of course, it looks at Laffer curves, it balances its current interests to have as much revenue as possible to finance the war, to keep the population happy with future prospects. It looks like the finance ministry today has its effective discount rate when it looks at the decisions, probably not even in the 20% headline number of the central bank, but more like 40% or so. So when the oil companies are talking with the central bank, well, lighten the tax load, we'll deliver you more oil production, you'll have more money. As a result, finance ministry is rather daft to this called. But it might change. Okay, climate change. With climate change, not in Russia, Russian energy strategy does pay some lip service to climate concerns. Has to, because, well, Russia tries as hard as possible to keep some contact, some links with the world. Climate agenda is probably one of the few areas it can talk to the rest of the world. Climate conferences, the COPs, probably are the few ones that Russian delegations are invited to. So it can't go into complete climate denial. Well, Russia is more with OPEC and other Saudis, and like when it comes to forecasts of what would be the oil demand. So it doesn't really recognize IEA falling, plummeting oil demand prospects. What is the effect on the climate change from this last situations from 20 years? I'd say energy security concerns are a much stronger driver when it comes to decarbonization than concerns over climate. People used to have what they have called hyperbolic discounting of further away things. So they don't really take the risks that might show themselves in 10 years seriously. Well, the risks that show up seriously next winter. So when a grumpy Russian grandfather tell the people you're going to freeze next winter, is going to be so much more convincing than when a Swedish teenager tell them they're going to fry in 10 years. So with this, the pickup in solar panels, sun, wind, and so on in Europe goes up quite substantially. At the same time, the price of switching off Russian gas, for example, in Germany, is firing up back the brown coal station. The dirtiest fuel there is, really. So it's a mixed bag. Long term, I think it gave strong impetus to decarbonization. But, oh, hold on, sorry, just a small remark. But also, the Western governments have come into an interesting policy conundrum. They had to make some firefighting in terms of how much gas would be available to Europe. Suddenly, the Russian gas that was just bought and could be switched off at any moment would have to be replaced with some sort of indigenous gas or gas coming from other sources. So it would have to come to European energy companies or to Qataris and say, we need your gas. And all these people were telling them, yeah, sure, we know that you're going to cut off gas purchases within just a few years. We're not going to invest in short-term gas production. We need assurances that our investments would be recouped. And we are accustomed to recouping our investments over 15, 20 years. So please either sign the take or pay on gas, and Europe did with Qataris on rather long term, or assure us that if the hydrocarbons we are producing now would suddenly become a stranded asset, will be compensated for that. So the need to alleviate the shortage of originally Russian origin hydrocarbons today forced at least European governments to make additional investments, either direct or indirect through these assurances, into combustible fuels, which is a negative element of the climate story.
Great. Well, I'll just echo what Sergey said about the impact on climate change. It cuts both ways. On the one hand, this greater energy insecurity that we now all see, especially if you're a European gas consumer and you're getting cut off by Moscow, makes you look for ways to move away from hydrocarbons more quickly. So that actually accelerates the green agenda. But the reality of it is that in the interim period, we're even more reliant on our own oil and gas if we can't count on those who would weaponize it. So we have to turn back to allies and to our own internal resources and see if we can't do it in a way that is less harmful than opening up the coal mines. On the broader trends that you were talking about and on the question of decline, I'll talk about the broader trends briefly, but both refining and shipping. And this ties back to this question about mismeasuring risk and how we've been overly cautious in the way we measure risk. So refining, Sergey talked about how the drone strikes up to now have had some effect, but not a huge effect. And I think Dr. Inozemtsev mentioned yesterday that the Russians have put tens of billions of dollars into sophisticated refining technology, again, 75% of which was coming from overseas. And I watched that over the years. I've been to many of these refineries that Sergey was telling us about. And it's not just that you buy a distillation unit, you also buy a whole service process. And if you don't get those pieces, like buying a fancy car, you got to take it in every 6 months, and that's how they really make their money. If you don't get it serviced regularly by qualified people and all the right parts upgraded and replaced, it starts to break down. So we're starting to see some deterioration there, but that takes time. And in terms of the drone strikes, from my understanding, the reason they've stopped is not because they weren't effective, it's because Western coalition partners were afraid they'd be too effective and that there would be not enough Russian refined product going onto the market. And if you recall 2 or 3 years ago and earlier, the Western markets were heavily reliant on diesel from Russia. Russia has, good big diesel refining capacity. And if there's a shortage in Europe, that's bad. But the refining trends, there's broader trends are changing, and there's new capacity coming on in places like Nigeria and the Middle East. And suddenly we don't have the need so much any longer for that Russian capacity. So one of the questions internally around sanctions is, do we need to revisit this? Are we being too risk averse when it comes to allowing the Ukrainian drone strikes to take out some of this capacity? Same thing holds for shipping. We've now sanctioned 60 of the 300 plus active shadow fleet ships, but there's been real reluctance to do too much of it for fear that you take too many out and then there's going to be a rise in freight rates because the markets get concerned, and that's going to have a knock-on effect at the pumps and run up to an election. It's that simple. But when we actually do sanction these ships, there's been no movement in the price. So perhaps we're being overly risk averse here. And certainly London feels that, and they've restarted their shadow fleet ship sanctioning process. So these do tie very much into these global trends, and it's a question of very carefully analyzing and measuring and testing and probing. Finally, on decline, which I think actually, Sergey and I share this absolute fascination. How is Russia going to deal with the decline of the easy oil in Russia? Because it is in steep decline. And it's very much of a technology question. It's all about not how much oil you can produce. Russia can produce tons of oil, It's how expensive it is and how much risk there is in making certain you're developing it efficiently. And for that, advanced technology is critical. And the reason why you still have Western oilfield service companies in Russia active, making billions of dollars as we speak annually, is because they have unique capabilities in managing that risk. And they help revive Russian production in the 1990s. There wasn't new oil discovered. It was all about technology and capital and risk taking. And they continue to help Russia manage that decline and keep costs down. Now, here's another debate. And the debate is, should we allow those companies to continue being there? There are some people who say, if we tell them they have to get out, Russian production falls off a cliff. I have more confidence in Russia's capability to manage it. It's just it'll be more expensive. Other people say the OFS company should be pulled out because it will raise the perceived risks in Moscow. I'll pause at that.
It's just a couple clarifications that I think are important indeed. Russian oilfield services industry was not dominated, but foreign companies had a very substantial presence in there. However, how did it happen that Schlumberger and others bought Russian players? So the current Russian subsidiaries of Schlumberger, SLB, and others is pretty much the former Russian companies with a new sign on them, with the same people working. Interesting enough that almost a quarter of global Schlumberger engineering staff is Russian speaking. Some of these people are Ukrainian, some of these people are from Kazakhstan, many of them are from Russia. Well, they also work world over, Algeria, Malaysia, Nigeria, other places, but it's hard to call this Western experience, intelligence, expertise, and like. So if Schlumberger decides to leave, the people would stay, as well as the plants that manufacture equipment. So that's probably one of the reasons why Schlumberger is allowed to stay, because it's not going to change much. And the flow of Western developed Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, and so on technologies into Russia has pretty much stopped in 2014. So there is a diversion in there. Quite a few things are developed by Schlumberger Russia in-house, in Russia, by these Russian engineers. Some of these engineers are not necessarily Russians. They could be Malaysians, Nigerians, and like, but it's not exactly a situation. It's just a sales office that brings in Russia what's being developed in Houston suburbs. It's just a bit more nuanced situation. Regarding shadow fleet, just still some time for advertising. I had a study published this morning on Carnegie website, which probably sheds some light on the statistics of the shadow fleet and others. So take a look if you're interested.
Thank you so much. So this is a good time to start with questions. Please go ahead. If you can just introduce yourself and pose your question.
Sure. Thank you, Sergey and Craig. That was incredibly informative. I'm Eddie Fishman from Columbia University. Two questions that are related. The first is around LNG. I think we can agree that the sanctions on frontier Russian oil projects in the Arctic, for instance, from 2014 were pretty successful. Seems like that playbook is being reprised right now for LNG, with the goal basically of preventing Russia from becoming a major LNG producer. Do you think they'll work? Or do you think that 5-10 years from now, Novatek figure it out and they'll basically be, shipping LNG the same way that, the US and others are? And then related question, this is more macro. I think the International Energy Agency predicted that by 2030, Russia would forego about $1 trillion in energy revenues by virtue of the discounts, as well as declining production and declining gas sales to Europe. This was a couple of years, I want to say like 2 years ago at this point. Do you think that that's accurate? And if so, are we going to be talking, when we have this conference, in 2030, are we going to be saying, oh, well, Russia is no longer an oil and gas superpower?
Right. For starters, gas has never been the major element of Russian cash flow, right? For a short time in 2022, when oil exports were in shambles and gas prices were skyrocketing, that was different. But the traditional proportion was roughly 25% of the revenue was coming from the gas, 75 from oil. Gas has declined very severely. It, to small extent, has been compensated by the growing exports to China. Okay. LNG. Russia has never really been a strong shipbuilding power. It's pretty much a landmass country. So there never was any substantial expertise. It probably takes time. Russia was trying to jumpstart it with the Zvezda, the Star shipbuilding plant in the Far East, under auspices of Mr. Sechin. Like many things under auspices of Mr. Sechin, things happen, well, they have a mixed bag result. Lots of hot air. Lots of hot air and advertising, a bit of a mixed bag when you look closer into it. Well, they're trying. How successful would there be is a very good question. When it comes to cryogenics, also mixed bag. On one hand, there was some cryogenic technology developed because the first missiles that Sergey Korolev was designing and launching, they worked on liquefied oxygen, a much more difficult thing to make than methane. So yes, some technology was there. It was a different technology. When you develop things, well, costs do not matter. You have to launch a missile. When it comes to, well, costs do matter when you want to build an LNG plant and so on. Novatek was trying to build an LNG plant. They built their own technology called the Arctic Cascade. Mr. Michelson was highly critical of the result. Looks like the Russian manufacturers and designers promised him quite a lot, didn't deliver. Whether they would manage to succeed, it's a good question. I think Russia might be capable of building its own LNG plant. When it comes to LNG tankers, might be a bit more difficult for them. Sorry, what was the second question? Well, again, discounts, in my opinion, are not as high as many people say. In my opinion, the discounts today are something like $4 or $5 a barrel at most. However, Russia spends something like $5 to $6 a barrel more on transportation than it used to spend in the past. So these are the discounts to you. Oil production volumes are pretty much the same. Gas, well,
Just briefly in LNG, 10 years is a long time in the LNG game. And, you know, they've been waiting forever to get LNG on stream in a big way. And it's just been one setback after another. And you wait another 10 years and you're pretty much out of it. Everyone else is going to have markets already in place. So on $1 trillion, absolutely, I can run a spreadsheet and get you $1 trillion if you want. But it's, as they say, GIGO in bank modeling, garbage in, garbage out. We have no idea. We don't. I mean, you can make a plausible scenario for it, but there's so many variables. Just starting with the question of the discount, and if I might digress a moment on that. The interesting thing that happened when Europe decided to say, we will no longer take Russian oil, and I was shocked, all right, because as an historian, Europe has been the main buyer of Russian oil since the 1870s. The entire Russian oil infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, ports, personal relationships, trading lines, banks, insurance, it's all Europe. And for Europe suddenly in April of 2022 to say, you know what, we just don't want Russian oil anymore. It was shocking. And you know what? Western traders came to Russia's assistance. They said, we know another market, because Western traders are still there. And they said, don't worry, sell it to us, and we know exactly where it's going to go. And it went to India. And the traders made a mint for a few months. And then they were told, you guys got to get out. And so Russians figured out we can go to India. But India is one market. It's much smaller. And you're taking this huge amount of oil into a market that's far away, where you don't have relationships. And it's effectively a quasi-monopolistic buyer. What is going to happen? They're going to use a technical banking term, rip your face off. And that's exactly what happened. The Indians did so well out of the Russia trade, but Russians are smart and they figured out how to sort of divide and conquer. They found some other new markets and they cut supply. If you look at the big Saudi cut, or the big OPEC cut from the middle of last summer of 2023, almost all of it was Urals going to India, and the discount shrunk measurably. So there are all these variables that you can factor in. This is a moving target. We need to watch it really closely. There are opportunities, there are things to be done. But I'll pause with that because I hope there are other questions.
More questions from the audience, please go ahead.
Rachel Ziamba, NYU Center for New American Security. First, a comment, and it's not specifically to this panel, but I think it's relevant to this one. But we're talking about Russia-West economic warfare. And so I think just re-entering and reminding, especially on the energy side, Japan's role, right? It came up a little bit, but, you know, I mean, just as we're thinking about, and especially as we're thinking about what about other jurisdictions, you know, thinking about notions of global West and otherwise, because I think the Japanese sort of, you know, being dragged out, kicking and screaming on some of the projects is relevant. My question is about China, though, which I think you both alluded to a bit, and I'm just interested in any thoughts you have about. I mean, China's clearly sort of playing hardball on some of the future projects. They seem to have stayed in on some of the projects they were already involved in. Maybe forced out, less so than the Europeans and the Japanese on Arctic LNG too. But what are your sort of thoughts about Chinese investment, China's ability to provide the components needed? Sergey, you rightly, I think, highlight this sort of ice-breaking tankers is definitely something the Chinese and Russians can't provide now. But just any thoughts kind of going forward on China's role, particularly on the investment side?
Just a second. Is there any other question from the audience? Just to make sure that everybody has a chance. Please, would you like to ask?
I'm Nargis Kasyanova. I run a program on Central Asia data center next door. And I have two Central Asia related questions. There are two pipeline projects now under discussion to bring Eurasian gas to China, and that's our Siberia 2 and the Turkmen Line D, basically Central Asia China gas pipeline. Is there competition between the two? Because it's also substantial. This one is 50 BCM, this one is 30 BCM. And would Russia in principle be now kind of interested in the existence of Transcaspian gas pipeline, which would bring gas to European markets that it lost? And the second, in the description, restrictions on uranium markets also mentioned. I was wondering if you can comment on that. If there is Kazakhstan is producer number one of uranium. Is there competition between the two? And how would you comment on the ongoing Russia's push to Central Asia, building nuclear power plants, and kind of how important is Central Asia and other regions for Russian nuclear energy sector?
I think these are questions and sub-questions. So please choose whichever one you would like to answer, and then we will get some questions from the online audience.
Let me say a few words on the Chinese pipelines. Well, a huge subject, we could easily spend an hour on that. My opinion is Chinese market is big enough, so there will be enough space in it for Turkmen pipeline and part of Siberia too. I don't really think that they're mutually exclusive. I think there's also a strategic reason for China to want Russian gas pipeline as well as Turkmen. If there is any tensions on the sea lanes, if you look how LNG is developed to China, it goes through Malacca Straits, it goes through Taiwan Straits. Where is it coming from? It's coming from Australia, one of the AUKUS countries. It's coming from Qatar, but it's coming from a project that's developed by ExxonMobil and others. So I think that there is a big fear on the Chinese policymakers' minds that comes worst, these LNG supplies could be cut at several points, at source, in transit. Nothing like this is going to happen to Russian or Turkmenian gas, leaving aside the issue that's really the cheapest gas China has, Russian in particular. So if you look at the price formulas that's in there, while they're trying to keep it secret, well, I managed to figure out what they are. Russian gas is roughly $40 per million thousand cubic meters cheaper than Turkmenian, and still a rather low cost gas. So there's economic reason and strategic reason for China to keep these supplies going. Why China is dragging its feet with Power of Siberia too? Because it can. So it doesn't need that particular gas tomorrow, day after tomorrow, maybe. Tomorrow, maybe not. It knows that Russia has nowhere to go. So it thinks that long cooking tenderizes the potential supplier. That's what they do. So that might be discussions on level of take or pay, price formulas, and so on. But in my opinion, that pipeline would happen. Trans-Caspian pipeline, really interesting subject. Why Russia would agree to that? First of all, Russia still has some participation in the European market. Even if the Ukrainian route closes, there still will be Turkish stream, Balkan stream, Serbia, and so on. So Russia is interested. The less gas comes to Europe, better. And also, it's not probably inclined to make any gifts. So I think that position would still be there.
So on the question of China, it's such an interesting matter, China and Russian gas. But lest I forget, China in many ways is such a major player in the transition. Electric vehicles, solar panels are probably the greatest adversary that Russian hydrocarbon dependency faces going forward. So just a side comment. On gas, in November of 2021, 3 months before the full-scale invasion, JP Morgan, one of my former arch competitors, led a 500 million euro bond for Gazprom. And the coupon was priced at 1.85%. So they're paying an interest rate on €500 million at just below 2%. It was in London. Okay. Today, Gazprom can no longer borrow in the Western markets. Gazprom has $82 billion in debt today. They can only refinance that or borrow new debt in the domestic market. 50 billion of that is Western debt that is going to come due and has to be repaid by new borrowing in the domestic market. Does anybody know what Gazprom bonds on the ruble market are yielding today? If you don't, I suggest you go buy them because they're yielding 21% and is as good as houses because Gazprom will never default. The Russian government won't allow it. Okay? So, Power of Siberia 2. I think the Western coalition forces should be doing everything possible to encourage China to sign Power of Siberia 2 as quickly as possible because it will bankrupt Gazprom. The costs of constructing the pipeline to China are going to be very large if the Power of Siberia 1 is anything to go by. And Gazprom has no access to debt capital at an affordable rate to finance all of that. And I'll tell you why. It's because of what Vladimir Putin did with gas into Europe. The only profitable business on scale that Gazprom had was European sales. Russia is a public service. It is corporate charity. It's provided below cost and it's subsidized by Europe. And as Sergey has shown very eloquently in his analysis of the economics of Power of Siberia 1, it's barely making any profit. And so China is not a place you make money. China is a place where you put, in fact, Power of Siberia hasn't even paid for itself yet. they're still paying off the loans. So China is not a place to make money. It's a place to curry favor and have friends, but not to make money for Russian gas. Europe is the only place. All the infrastructures are there, et cetera. So on Power of Siberia 2, who knows? I would just note that Power of Siberia 1, does anybody recall when the pricing agreement was actually signed? I know, as I'm sure you do, the people who had the thankless task of negotiating with the Chinese for a decade on pricing. And suddenly, in May of 2014, does that ring a bell to anybody, 2014? Order came on down, get a deal done at any cost. And they got a deal done at any cost. So I think it's really important to measure things properly, to look at the economics of things, to appreciate what the potential impact is going to be. And coming back to a point I wanted to draw out earlier, one of the things we aren't looking at, we're looking at GDP right now, we're looking at low unemployment in Russia, but what we aren't looking at is how all of that is being financed. We think it's being financed by oil and gas. We think it's being financed by an expanded budget, but actually the way it's being financed primarily is through borrowing from Russian banks, through credit expansion. Imagine you have an ATM where you can go and draw as much money as you want and nobody will ever ask you to repay it or using a credit card. We've seen $400 billion of new lending in the first 2 years of the full-scale war. $400 billion, that's the size of the entire national federal budget for a year. And as Elvira Nabiullina complained in her recent rate hike press conference, much of that lending is insensitive to interest rates. She can raise them to 50%, and the government is still going to say to the banks, you have to lend money to this defense contractor. You've got to lend money to Gazprom. What they're doing is they're creating a very large credit bubble. And at some point or another, that causes fundamental problems, as we learned ourselves in 2008, and there have to be big bailouts. The best independent Russian economists are focusing on this now. We should be looking at it more closely too. Doesn't mean that there's going to be a massive crisis anytime soon, but we should be watching it because it tells us Russia's not invincible. Russia is not 10 feet tall. They don't have magic technocrats. They're making big mistakes too.
I probably have to clarify a few points here. For starters, I wouldn't say that domestic gas sales in Russia is public charity. Used to be, not anymore. Gas prices were going up. Gas prices in Russia domestic are roughly $2-3 per MMBTU. Cost of production is something like 40 cents per MMBTU. So no, it's
Full-scale costs, not just cost of production.
what is full-scale costs? You have huge Vakulenko and Urengoy gas fields that have been drilled out. You have the pipelines in there. All these existing wells could produce gas for like 50 years. So yes, it's not necessarily covering the costs of developing Urengoy and laying that pipe, but that's some cost. So if you look at the current costs and future profits of domestic gas sales, that's highly profitable. Not as highly profitable as the European gas sales were, but it has already been fully amortized expenditure. So currently it is printing money for Gazprom.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And considering that roughly half of Russian domestic market is supplied not by Gazprom, but independent gas suppliers, and it's a competitive market, there are players who are willing to sell gas exclusively to the domestic Russian gas market and find it profitable. So that would be a bit of exaggeration. Talking of Power of Siberia 2, well, that's an interesting case. Indeed, it would be not cheap to build a pipeline. However, if you look at what it would take to build it all, it would take steel. Steel has to be converted to pipes. The pipes would have to be laid in the country. However, Russia has specialized assets that can do only that. Produce iron ore, smelt steel, roll pipe, and all these plants, all these iron mines and so on have nothing else to do. You have Gazprom design bureaus with tens of thousands of people employed in there, and Gazprom keeping paying them salaries because, well, if they're allowed to leave, they would never get them back. Well, Gazprom puts them to work to design the pipeline. then Gazprom owns all these construction companies with people and machinery and all that who are able to do just one thing, lay gas pipelines. In the past, these construction companies, for example, were laying oil pipeline from Shaiba oil field in Saudi Arabia, 800 miles to the port in Saudi Arabia. Well, cannot do it anymore. So all these specialized assets are already in Russia. So when you calculate the cost of actually doing that, that also becomes a slightly difficult calculation. What it does require is a large amount of workforce, and Russia is quite short of workforce, and this would become a problem. But that's the only element that really imposes costs on Russia Inc.
Can I just make a shameless plug as well for a paper I'm coming out with very shortly, actually on the economics of Gazprom. And I would just point to one really simple calculation. If you look at the 2023 annual report for Gazprom, in fact, actually, I don't want to wish that on anyone. It's 70 pages of dense IFRS accounts, but it's very rewarding if it's something that you're into. And I think, or just look at the FT headline, $7 billion loss, despite the fact that Russia is still selling 15% of its gas to Europe. And they're getting as much from Europe as they're getting domestically. Yet they still have a big loss. So I ask, how can the domestic market be profitable if they're showing a big loss? And if you look at the gas division and you strip out the Gazprom neft, Sergey did such an excellent job at Gazprom neft that it's actually carrying a lot of Gazprom now. It's a $23 billion cash flow deficit in the gas division, and it's all there in the accounts. So the gas division has a lot of cost cutting. It has to do, it's got massive debt, which is getting only more expensive by the day that it has to service. And that just takes its toll. Eventually, somebody's got to pay in the end.
Well, just there was a question posed. I have to answer. Indeed, Gazprom. Okay, yeah, sure. Gazprom has incurred huge losses in 2023, no doubt of that. It did post substantial profits in the first half of 2024. And if you look at the source of those losses, Russian government imposed extraordinary taxes on Gazprom to extract the value Gazprom was collecting in 2022. Well, these extraordinary taxes dragged into 2024, but there will be no more. Surprisingly, the volume of these extraordinary taxes is very close to what the loss was that Gazprom posted. And some of these losses were paper losses for readjustment of value of assets and liabilities, and the write-offs of many European subsidiaries that Gazprom had. So, yes, Gazprom is nowhere near as profitable as it was. Gazprom division is indeed struggling to adjust to the new reality, but the situation of 2023 and the losses there posted, that's something that needs to be looked closer in detail, not to be confused or misled.
Great. With this, I would like to thank our knowledgeable, insightful, and very passionate panelists.